The Cedar Revolution, also known as Independent Upsprings, was the reaction to the assassination to the former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri on February 14, 2005, along with the 22 other people that were murdered in a car bombing. This resulted in one of the largest nonviolent revolutions in the Lebanon history, estimating up to over 1 million supporters. The nonviolent movement was the cause of a long line of tension that had built up over the last 30 years, beginning in the Civil War in 1976 that lasted until 1990, that had brought in the pro-Syrian government and the Syrian troops into Lebanon. The Syrian and Lebanese people were under high conflicting circumstances and lacked a compromising element that brought on a lack of support from the Lebanese people towards the pro-Syrian government. The Cedar Revolution was a nonviolent movement that lasted only 1 month and took place in Lebanon's capital. The protesters used strategies such as human chain links, marches, banners, public speeches, sit-ins, chants, and many other forms of nonviolent protest to demonstrate what the country was demanding. The name Cedar Revolution came from the countless number of Lebanese flags at the protest. Once the movement had begun, the U.S. and French presidents had made it public of their support for the removal of the Syrian troops and the resignation of the Syrian government in Lebanon. The Cedar Revolution began on February 21st, following the death of Rafik Hariri. 20,000 supporters marched into St. George's Hotel, where the Prime Minister was killed, to attend his funeral. The protest began calling for the withdrawal of the Syrian government by chanting "Syria out," and formed what was called Tent Camp, or Camp Freedom, outside the Martyr Square as one of the nonviolent tactics used by the supporters. The revolution had 4 main goals. 1. For the ruling government to withdraw out of power. 2. Syrian military withdrawal. 3. An investigation of Hariri's death. 4. The withdrawal of intelligence services. The Lebanese people were seeking for a new government to replace the one that had ruled over them for 30 years, and wanted a new government to provide freedom and peace, and most importantly, democracy. Here is a short video clip of some of the protesters at the Cedar Revolution. Along with individual supporters, there were many groups and organizations that supported the Cedar Revolution, including Sunni Future Movement, which was led by Hariri's son Sahad during the revolution, which focuses on civil, pluralistic, democratic state for the people. The Christian Free Patriotic Movement, and the student movement of the outlawed Christian Lebanese forces. The civil society groups that were involved included student and youth movements, women's groups, syndicates of writers, journalists, artists, and workers, the Lebanese Bar Association, industry groups, and many chambers of commerce. Ahmad al-Rajwani, an organizer of the Cedar Revolution and the member of a future movement party, described what he saw at the Cedar Revolution and said, quote, "When I arrived, there were Lebanese flags everywhere," he said. "We were too far away to hear the speeches, but left and right you saw Christian and Muslims together, old and young. We all had hopes, and though not everyone had the same hopes, they agreed we needed a change." Once the revolution began, it took off at lightning speed and took the country no time at all to enforce their power on the government to meet their demands. They protested every day in the capital, making it impossible for them to be ignored. On February 24th, Syria stated that it would remove their troops from Lebanon, and 4 days later, on February 28th, the president made his resignation public. On March 14th, The largest march occurred in the Martyrs' Square, accumulating 1.2 million people, where the armed forces were told to stop the protesters, but failed to delegate their orders and received flowers and other gifts from the protesters that would ultimately emphasize nonviolence the protesters were demonstrating. On April 7th, there was a 1595 resolution that began the investigation of Hariri's death. And finally, on April 26th, all of the Syrian troops had been evacuated out of Lebanon. To further help explain this revolution, one could look back at the workings of Socrates, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr., who emphasized the importance of nonviolence. Socrates stated that it is never good to do injustice. Then certainly it is never good to do injustice in response to injustice. In comparison, one could understand that you cannot put out fire with more fire. Mahatma Gandhi explained his belief of nonviolence with his philosophy Satyagraha, which says that means and ends are inseparable. Gandhi states that it is contradictory to try to use unjust means to obtain justice, or to try to use violence to obtain peace. Gandhi also thought that if you use violent, coercive, unjust means, whatever ends you produce will necessarily embed that injustice. Martin Luther King Jr. was another great advocate for nonviolence. His efforts were greatly portrayed in the civil rights movement, and he was heavily influenced by Gandhi's philosophy. While in Birmingham, Alabama jail, he wrote a letter that would further explain his thoughts on violence and the 4 things a nonviolent campaign should consist of, which is a collection of facts to determine whether injustice exists, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. The Cedar Revolution was a nonviolent movement that demonstrated the efforts of the Lebanese supporters that would eventually lead to the change in government after 30 years and the withdrawal of Syrian troops after losing their beloved former prime minister that ignited the flame in Lebanese citizens that would compel them to inflict nonviolent action that would change their country.